Jared Dillian Show.
I'm Jared Dillian. This is the Jared Dillian Show. If you want to call to talk about your money, please call 844-305-7800. That's 844-305-7800. This is the Jared Dillian Show. I'm going to take a break and talk about fish. Fish! We are actually going to talk about fish on the Jared Dillian Show. In fact, I could talk about fish for an entire show. I have very strong opinions on fish. I used to be in the Coast Guard, as you know. My whole career was basically doing fishery stuff. So my first tour of duty was on a Coast Guard cutter in Washington State. It was a 210-foot cutter, had 72 people on it, 12 officers and 60 enlisted. Have you ever been out to sea in the Pacific Northwest? It's a bit bumpy. I will say that. It is a bit bumpy. The first time I got underway, we were headed to Alaska, and we headed out the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and we had to get there in a hurry. So we were going 14 knots, which was pretty fast for us. And there were these big swells that were coming down the strait. I mean, like these 10, 15-foot swells in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and we were. The thing with the Coast Guard cutter that I was on, it didn't really roll. It didn't go back and forth, but it pitched. It went up and down. After about an hour of this, I was puking. And I could not stop puking. I was puking for hours. And my roommate, he was puking. And we were together puking at the same time in the same toilet, just puking constantly. Eventually, I got I took some medicine and I got to keep it down. My roommate couldn't keep anything down. They had to give him a suppository, like a motion sickness suppository. They had to, yeah, exactly. It's no fun. It's a little choppy out there. So, anyway, my stateroom, where I lived on the ship, my stateroom had the nickname the anti-gravity chamber because it was really high up and it was really far forward. And this pitching, I would be in my bed at night, which we called a rack. I would be in the rack. And if we were in heavy weather, I was catching air while I was sleeping. I was catching air. You almost needed a seatbelt. It was unbelievable. So this was my life when I was 22 years old. Anyway, our main job was to board fishing vessels and ensure compliance with regulations. So like I said, the first trip was Alaska, and we went to this fisheries training program up there, and then we went out into the Bering Sea. Now, the Bering Sea is home to a lot of fish, like the Alaskan pollock. And the pollock is a very common fish. There's just tons of it. If you go to McDonald's and you get the Filet-O-Fish, that's Alaskan pollock. In fact, if you go to any fast food place or if you go to the freezer at the grocery store and you get fish sticks, it's Alaskan pollock. All of it comes from the Bering Sea. Okay. And it comes from these big catcher processor fishing vessels, which, I mean, they're huge. They're like 200 feet long, and they catch the fish. They have basically a pelagic trawl, and they catch the fish, and they bring it on board, and they process it on board the ship. They have a factory inside the ship that process. They have really like sort of assembly lines where the fish come in and they clean all the slime off of them, and then they fillet them, and then they freeze them, and then they put them in boxes. They have packaging. So if you go in the holds of these ships, they're just full of boxes of fish. Catcher processors. They're just big floating factories. And it's mostly pollock and something called Pacific cod. We boarded, if you go a little closer to shore, they have Dover sole. We boarded some Dover sole boats. If you want to talk about a fish that smells really, really bad and is very slimy, that's the Dover sole. Dover sole is tasty. It's really, really good, but it's a gross fish. It's really disgusting. So when I was on these catcher processors, they'd bring on a net with 100 tons of fish in one net. It was huge. You'd be standing on deck, and it would be like twice the size of you. And it was so full of fish that the fish are exploding. They're literally exploding through the net because it's so full, right? So there was this thing in the 90s. there was a bunch of college kids in the Pacific Northwest, and they would put ads in the paper, come make some money for the summer. And they would work on these catcher-processor boats on the slime line. That's what they would call it. They'd work on the slime line. And they would fillet fish all day. And they would make like $30,000 in the summer and pay their tuition. But then they would have arthritis for the rest of their lives. So I don't think they have college kids anymore. I think it's mostly immigrants. So on this trip to Alaska, I was still pretty new. I wasn't doing any of the enforcement. I was just counting fish because we had to basically, in the logs of the ship, they had records of how much fish that they caught, and we had to count the fish, basically just counting boxes. And these holds are freezer holds, and they keep them exceptionally cold, like way below zero. Like it's super, super cold. So you'd be down there counting fish for hours on end, and it's really, really cold. This was, like I said, this is my life. I was 22 years old. Eventually, I went to law enforcement school, which is training to be a cop. That's what it was. I was a cop. I was a fish cop, and I carried a gun. 22, 23 years old, cruising around with a gun, boarding fishing vessels. Pretty crazy. I never drew my weapon for any reason. In fact, I would say 99% of the boardings were pretty safe. All fishing vessels have guns. Okay, they all have guns. And in fact, on the catcher processors, they had handguns. They would keep a handgun down on the deck where they brought the fish on board because they would shoot the halibut. They would bring these, they would have halibut that would sort of flop on board. And these fish are very strong. They're very strong fish, and they'd start flapping all over the place, and they could knock people overboard. So if a halibut flopped on board, they would actually shoot the halibut. They called it a halibut popper. So there were guns all over the place. I had to learn a lot about fish. Most of the boats I was boarding in the Pacific Northwest were trawlers. They were getting fish off the bottom of the ocean. They were called ground fish. Now, there were some trap boats, or you call pot boats. They don't really look like pots. They look sort of like a dog crate. And they take these traps and they put them on the bottom of the ocean. And you have these fish called sablefish. Now, you probably had sablefish before if you've been in a fancy restaurant. Like if you go to Nobu in New York City, they serve something called the miso black cod. Now, black cod is sablefish. It is the most delicious fish that you can ever have. It's unbelievable. It is also a very dumb fish. They didn't even have to put bait in the traps. The sablefish, the black cod, they just say, oh, this looks like a cool place to hang out, and they go inside, and then they get caught. So then after that, I went to basically the Pacific headquarters, where I became the intelligence analyst for fisheries. Then I really had to learn a lot about fish, but not just at the state level, but at the international level. And one of my jobs was high seas driftnet fisheries. Now, driftnet is basically a net that is made out of fishing line. It's monofilament. It's made out of this fishing line. So you have these big, long nets, and what they would do is the fishing boats would just throw them in the ocean and wait a couple hours, and then they pull them back up. And the bad thing about drift nets is that they catch everything. Like everything gets stuck in a drift net, including dolphins and marine mammals and all kinds of stuff. And a lot of times the fishing boats would lose the drift nets. So the drift nets would just kind of float around on the ocean and keep killing fish. So the United Nations actually saw this problem and said, we are banning drift nets globally. Okay. Of course, the U.S. was the country that had to enforce this. So we enforced high seas drift net fisheries, and the goal was to find these high seas drift net fishing boats. I was the intel guy, so my job was to find them. The guy that had the job before me was just a lazy pile of crap. He didn't do anything. He basically just drew this big rectangle in the Pacific Ocean and said, go there, and it's totally useless. So basically, I had to narrow it down a lot more than that, because you only have a certain amount of flight hours to deal with this stuff. So drift netters typically fish for salmon or tuna with drift nets, and I was focused on the salmon. So the thing I learned about salmon, and this is salmon coming off the coast of Russia, they like a certain temperature in the water. They like a very specific temperature. And you can measure this sea surface temperature by satellite. And the other thing I did was I dug deep in the archives and I pulled up some old academic papers from the 1970s showing salmon migration patterns. And between that and some other secret squirrel stuff I can't talk about, we were able to put together a very tight area where we would find high seas driftnet fishers. Anyway, the first flight out of Kodiak found 7 of these things. It was absolutely amazing. I also did work on something called the maritime boundary line. You have the Bering Sea, and the Bering Sea is in between Alaska and Russia, and there's a big line down the middle called the maritime boundary line, and we're supposed to fish on our side, and they're supposed to fish on their side. The problem is that all the fish are on our side because we were successful at managing our fisheries and the Russians weren't. So the Russians used to go over the boundary line into our side. So we used to catch them doing that. And I did a bunch of other stuff too. I also, just, tangentially related to this, I might be one of the only Coast Guard officers to spend time on a Navy submarine. I actually went out on a Navy submarine for about a week, and now I have all this useless knowledge about fish, in addition to my knowledge about personal finance that I will have for the rest of my life. We didn't even get to the good part of the discussion where we talk about IFQs, which is a way of having property rights for fish, and IFQs have been very successful at saving fisheries. So until next time, I'm Jared Dillian. This is The Jared Dillian Show.
Jared Dillian Show.